The letter arrived on a Tuesday, folded neatly in a faded envelope that smelled faintly of mildew. There was no return address, just my name scrawled in uneven handwriting. The kind of handwriting that spoke of either haste or trembling fingers. I shouldn't have opened it. Letters like these always come with strings, but curiosity, like an old scar, itches when you ignore it. Inside, the letter was short, blunt, and utterly unhelpful. Ashwick Manor stirs. It's taking them. Help before it's too late.
No signature.
Just those ominous words and an address I hadn't thought about in years. Ashwick Manor sat at the edge of town, a ruin long abandoned to ivy and whispers. Stories had circled it for decades. A family tragedy, disappearances, and the sort of tales that make people lock their doors at night. I hadn't bought into the hype back then, and I wasn't about to start now. Still, there was something about that letter. The phrasing stuck like a burr under my skin. It's taking them. Taking who? I found myself staring at the words for far longer than I cared to admit, the coffee in my mug cooling into sludge. By the time I reached for my coat, I'd convinced myself it was just curiosity, not the creeping unease growing in my chest. The drive out to Ashwick Manor took longer than expected. The roads had become more overgrown since I'd last been out that way, the asphalt cracked and dusted with weeds. When I finally reached the property, the manor loomed like a corpse draped in vines, its windows hollowed out and its roof sagging under the weight of time. I parked my car a cautious distance away and surveyed the scene. The wind was restless, tugging at the brittle branches of skeletal trees lining the property. They rattled like bones, the sound grating against the quiet. I tightened my coat around me, tucking my notebook and pen into the inside pocket. Around my neck, the amulet my father had left me felt heavier than usual, as if it knew what lay ahead. Ashwick Manor didn't feel abandoned, it felt watched. Stepping through the rusted gate, I caught my first shiver. A breath of cold that didn't belong to the crisp autumn air curled over my skin. The grounds were a mess of tangled grass and broken statues, their features worn smooth by time. A fountain stood at the center, dry and choked with dead leaves. Despite myself, I noted the oddity. No birds.
No insects.
Just silence and the crunch of my boots on gravel. When I reached the manor's front steps, I hesitated. Not out of fear, mind you, but out of something deeper. A nagging sense that stepping inside would mean stepping into something far bigger than me. Bigger than anything I wanted to be a part of. I could still walk away, pretend I'd never gotten the letter, go home, and bury myself in a book until this all felt like a bad idea I'd barely entertained. But I didn't. The door creaked open with less effort than I expected, the sound echoing in the cavernous space beyond. Dust and decay hung heavy in the air, thick enough to taste. My flashlight cut through the gloom, illuminating a grand foyer gone to ruin. A staircase rose in front of me, its once elegant banister splintered and warped. Paint peeled from the walls like dead skin, revealing patches of dark wood beneath. I was about to step further inside when it happened. A voice. Not a shout or a murmur, but a whisper, soft and close, as though someone was leaning right against my ear. Turn back. I froze. The words hit me like a cold hand gripping the back of my neck, sending a jolt of adrenaline through my veins. My flashlight wavered as I turned sharply, expecting to find someone, or something, looming behind me. But there was nothing. Just the empty doorway and the restless sway of the trees beyond. All right? I muttered under my breath, masking nerves with sarcasm. Starting early, are we? The whisper didn't come again, but the sensation of being watched only deepened. My sixth sense, the thing I still struggled to explain or ignore, buzzed faintly in my chest, a warning I'd learned to heed. The manor wasn't just old or haunted by the weight of history. It was alive in some way, watching, waiting. I stepped fully inside, forcing my breathing to stay even. I pulled out my notebook and jotted down the whisper, the way the cold seemed to thicken in certain parts of the room, and the subtle weight of the amulet around my neck. It glimmered faintly in the weak light of my flashlight, its silver surface warm against my chest. A small comfort in a place like this. Moving deeper into the house, I noticed the dust on the floor wasn't as undisturbed as I expected. There were faint tracks, barely visible but fresh. Someone else had been here. Maybe they still were. And then I heard it. The faint creak of a floorboard upstairs. Instinctively, my hand drifted to the amulet again. The whisper echoed in my mind, as clear as if it had just been spoken. Turn back. But I knew I wouldn't. I never did. The air inside Ashwick Manor felt like it hadn't moved in decades. It was heavy with the scent of mildew and rot, every breath dragging cobwebs into my lungs. My boots scuffed against the warped floorboards, stirring dust into ghostly swirls. Somewhere in the distance, a faint creak echoed, though I was sure I was the only one inside. The room I entered next looked like it might have once been a study, or at least the remains of one. A large portrait hung crookedly over the fireplace, its ornate frame tarnished and flaking. The subjects in the painting were frozen in time. A family of 5, their expressions unervingly neutral. The father stood stiffly, his hand resting on a leather-bound book, while the mother held the youngest child, a toddler, on her lap. Beside them, 2 older children sat perched in high-backed chairs, staring straight ahead. Something about their faces made me uneasy. It wasn't just the faded paint or the eerie lighting from the broken windows. It was their eyes. They didn't seem to follow me in the way old paintings sometimes do, but they weren't exactly still, either. It was as if they were looking past me, seeing something I couldn't. On a hunch, I lifted the portrait off the wall, ignoring the grime that smeared my fingers. The back of the frame was covered in a sheet of brittle paper, yellowed with age. Written on it, in sharp, uneven handwriting, was a list of names. Some were crossed out, the ink slashing violently through them. Josephine Ashwick, I read aloud, my voice breaking the oppressive silence. Henry Ashwick. Samuel Ashwick. I ran my finger down the list, jotting each name in my notebook. Beneath the family names were others, unfamiliar and unrelated. Arthur Daly, Margaret Lorne, Eleanor Finch. The crossed-out names made my stomach twist. Why would someone do that? As I replaced the painting, a sound drew my attention. A faint shuffle, like feet dragging across the floor. I turned sharply, every sense on edge. "Hello," I called, my voice steady, though my pulse wasn't. No answer. The floor creaked again as I moved further into the manor. The next room was a dining area, though area was generous. The table was thick with dust, its once polished surface marred by time and neglect. A single plate sat in the center, its contents long rotted away, leaving only a dark, unidentifiable smear. Yet, beside it, something caught my attention. A glass of water. It wasn't dusty. The realization hit like ice down my spine. Someone had been here recently. My hand went instinctively to my amulet, the cool metal grounding me. I scanned the room more closely. Beneath the table, the dust was disturbed by what looked like the imprint of a chair recently pushed back. My fingers brushed against the edge of the glass, and it wobbled slightly, the water inside rippling. "Someone's messing with me," I muttered, though it didn't feel convincing. I moved to the staircase, its banister carved with intricate details that were now lost to peeling varnish and decay. About halfway up, I froze. Sitting on the step was a small, ragged toy, a stuffed bear, its button eyes dangling by threads. It didn't look like it belonged to the family in the painting. It was too modern, the kind of thing you'd find at a gas station toy rack. Kneeling, I picked it up carefully, half expecting it to move on its own. The fabric was worn, the seams barely holding together. Someone had clung to this bear for years. Another noise broke the silence. This time it was louder, a distinct thump from somewhere above me. I stood abruptly, scanning the shadows at the top of the stairs. "All right, let's not play games," I said, my voice echoing back to me. "If someone's here, you've got my attention." No response. The steps groaned under my weight as I climbed, the bear still in my hand. The upstairs hallway was darker, the windows here boarded up tightly. The air felt thicker, oppressive, like walking through syrup. Doors lined the corridor, most of them shut. I tried the first one. Locked. The second, also locked. The third opened with a groan, revealing a child's bedroom. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls, and a tiny bed sat against the far corner. The sheets were still tucked neatly, though they were yellowed with age. On the wall, a crude drawing was pinned. A family drawn in crayon, with a sun in the corner and a house in the background. I backed out of the room, unease gnawing at my gut. Something wasn't adding up. As I turned to leave, I heard it again. The whisper. Turn back. The voice was so close, as if someone had spoken directly into my ear. I spun around, my notebook dropping to the floor. No one was there. I bolted back down the stairs, my pulse hammering. Reaching the front door, I grabbed the handle and yanked. It didn't budge. I twisted harder, slamming my shoulder against the wood. Nothing. It was as if the door was fused to the frame. Come on, I muttered, panic threading through my voice. Not now. I backed away, glancing at the windows. They were boarded up too tightly to break without tools. My eyes darted around the room, seeking another way out, when I noticed something. The bear I had left on the stairs was gone. By the time night fell, the manor felt like a living thing. The air inside shifted, no longer just still and stale. It throbbed, like a pulse you could only feel if you stood perfectly silent. And I stood silent, not by choice but because the sounds had started. It began faintly, almost benign. The creak of a floorboard above me. I told myself it was the old wood settling, maybe a squirrel that had found its way into the walls. But then it happened again, too deliberate, too measured. Footsteps. They paced back and forth in the room above me, slow and steady, as though whoever or whatever was up there was thinking deeply. I stayed in place, my back pressed against the cold stone of the dining room hearth, my pen poised over my notebook. My fingers were numb, either from the chill or from the fear. When the pacing stopped, the silence that followed was worse. The house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for me to make the first move. And then, breaking that fragile quiet, came the sound of muffled sobs. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. They came from behind one of the locked doors upstairs, but they didn't sound quite human. There was a strained quality to them, as if the throat that made them hadn't used its voice in a long time. I took out my voice recorder, the small gadget feeling absurdly inadequate in the face of whatever was in this house. Clicking it on, I aimed it upward and let it run. The sobbing continued for a few seconds, then stopped abruptly. I whispered into the recorder, 9:13 p.m. footsteps above. Possible sobbing from a locked room. Sounds not human. I clicked it off, my voice sounding small against the manor's ominous silence. As I moved through the room, something new joined the symphony of unease. The rhythmic creak of a rocking chair. Its pace was hypnotic, steady as a heartbeat. I followed the sound to what must have once been the parlor. The chair was there, swaying gently in the center of the room, though there was no one seated in it. I didn't approach it. Something deep inside me warned against it. Instead, I jotted a note in my notebook. Rocking chair moving on its own. No visible source. The pen felt heavy in my hand as I added a quick sketch of the chair's position in the room, an almost automatic action. When I looked up again, the chair had stopped moving. The house didn't want me here. That much was clear. I found myself wandering the main hallway, my feet drawn to the walls. Carved into the wood were strange symbols, some overlapping and others solitary. They seemed to form a pattern, though one I couldn't make sense of. Taking a closer look, I ran my fingers over one of the symbols. It was rough, crudely etched, but deliberate. Protective wards, perhaps? I wasn't an expert in occult symbolism, but my gut told me these weren't idle decorations. They were placed with purpose, desperation, even. Pulling my notebook from my coat pocket, I sketched the symbols quickly, trying to preserve the details. Some were vaguely familiar, shapes I'd come across in old books or whispered stories, but none I could place. My sixth sense stirred, an itch at the back of my mind that told me I was being watched. I turned sharply, but no one was there. The hallway was empty, but the air was charged, buzzing like static electricity. That's when the whispering started. I couldn't make out the words. They came from everywhere and nowhere at once, soft as a breeze but insistent, just on the edge of comprehension. I raised the recorder again, clicking it on and holding it out in front of me like a talisman. The whispers ebbed and flowed, overlapping each other, forming a sort of rhythm. There was something off about the cadence, something that made my stomach twist. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I understood the words, it would be too late for me. Forcing myself to breathe, I leaned against the wall and clicked off the recorder. My fingers brushed another symbol carved into the wood, this one deeper and more jagged than the rest. As I touched it, a sudden chill surged through me, so sharp and cold it felt like I'd stepped into ice water. My amulet grew warm against my chest, its familiar weight grounding me. The house felt closer now, as if its walls had shifted inward. The sobbing, the whispers, the rocking chair. It was all building toward something, a crescendo of tension I couldn't name. My sixth sense was screaming at me, and the only thing louder was the voice in my head asking why I hadn't left yet. But the door wouldn't open, and I couldn't let it go. Not the whispers, not the symbols, not the footsteps that started again above me. This wasn't a haunting. It was something worse, something that had teeth. I flipped through my notebook, scanning the rough sketches I'd made of the symbols. They weren't random. I was sure of it now. They were a map, a warning, a spell, I didn't know which. Something beneath the surface. I murmured, the words half to myself, half to whatever unseen force shared the space with me. The manor seemed to hum in response, and somewhere deep within its bones, something shifted. I didn't expect to sleep in a place like Ashwick Manor, but exhaustion doesn't play by the rules of fear. I must have drifted off against the cold stone of the dining room hearth, my notebook still clutched in one hand, the amulet's faint warmth pressing against my chest. It wasn't restful sleep. How could it be? The dream was vivid, sharper than reality. In the dream, the air smelled faintly of wet leaves and old wood. I stood in a room I didn't recognize, though it was unmistakably part of the manor. Moonlight streamed through a crack in the boarded-up windows, illuminating the bare floorboards in stripes of pale silver. Then I saw him. The boy was standing in the middle of the room, unmoving. His face was starkly pale, so white it seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight. His hollow eyes bore into me, their emptiness sharper than any scream could have been. In his hands he clutched a small toy, a stuffed bear with one dangling eye, the same bear I'd seen on the stairs. I wanted to speak, to ask who he was, but the words caught in my throat like thorns. The boy tilted his head slightly, his lips parting as if he might say something, but no sound came. Then, with a motion so sudden it made my stomach lurch, he raised one thin arm and pointed behind me. I turned instinctively, though I didn't want to. The room was gone, replaced by darkness so complete it swallowed everything. A single sound broke through the void, the boy's laughter, high-pitched, eerie, and wrong. I jerked awake, heart pounding against my ribs, the sound of that laughter still echoing faintly in my ears. But it wasn't just a memory. It was real. Somewhere in the manor, a child was laughing. I stood, every muscle in my body tensed, and listened. The laughter came again, drifting down the hallway like a ghostly breeze. I grabbed my recorder and notebook, shoving them into my coat pocket as I followed the sound. The hallway stretched ahead of me, lined with doors that seemed to lean inward as though they were bowing under the weight of the house's secrets. At the far end, where the shadows pooled deepest, I saw him. The boy. He stood perfectly still, his form barely visible in the dim light. The bear dangled from his hand, its tattered ear dragging against the floor. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, his voice soft but clear, as if he'd whispered it directly into my ear. I blinked, and he was gone. The hallway was empty, but the space where he'd stood felt different, charged with a strange energy that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I approached slowly, my boots scuffing against the floorboards. At first, I thought the boy had simply disappeared, but then I noticed something. A faint outline in the wall, nearly imperceptible. A seam where there shouldn't have been one. I pressed my fingers against the surface. It felt wrong, the texture smoother and colder than the rest of the aged wood. Pushing harder, I heard a soft click, and the section of the wall swung inward with a low groan, revealing a hidden stairwell. The air that escaped the opening was different, damp and heavy, carrying the faint scent of earth and decay. A faint unease coiled in my stomach, but I couldn't turn away. Whatever was down there, it was important. The staircase descended into darkness, the steps narrow and uneven. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the small flashlight I kept there for emergencies. The beam of light cut through the gloom, revealing dirt walls and a ceiling that seemed to press closer the farther I went. At the bottom of the stairs, the air was colder, the kind of cold that sank into your bones. The room before me was larger than I expected, its walls lined with shelves that bowed under the weight of strange objects. Glass jars filled with cloudy liquids, crumbling books whose titles were worn beyond recognition, and small, carved figures that looked disturbingly human. In the center of the room was a table covered in dust and cobwebs. On it lay an array of objects. An ornate dagger, a bowl blackened with what I guessed was old blood, and a series of hand-drawn diagrams that I couldn't decipher in the dim light. I reached for my notebook, sketching the room and the table's contents as quickly as I could. The diagrams intrigued me, their shapes twisting in ways that seemed almost alive. The boys' laughter echoed again, softer this time, but closer. I spun, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The boy was nowhere to be seen, but his presence lingered, heavy and undeniable. My amulet grew warm against my chest, a silent reminder that whatever I'd stumbled into was more than I was prepared for. "Not supposed to be here," I murmured, repeating the boy's words to myself. The phrase wasn't just a warning. It felt like a truth, one that pressed on me with the weight of the manor itself. The faint sound of footsteps echoed from the stairwell behind me. My grip on the flashlight tightened as I stared back into the shadows, waiting to see what, or who, would emerge. The basement felt like another world entirely, disconnected from the creaking, crumbling manor above. The cold was sharper here, biting at my skin and settling deep into my bones. The walls, damp and mottled with mold, seemed to glisten faintly in the glow of my flashlight. They weren't stone, not entirely, closer to packed earth, reinforced with wooden beams that sagged under the weight of centuries. The shelves lining the walls were a macabre museum. Jars of murky liquid stood in neat rows, their contents distorted by time and grime. One jar held something that might have been an animal heart, shriveled and blackened, while another cradled what looked like an eyeball, its cloudy pupils staring at nothing. I tried not to look too closely. Beneath the jars, stacks of faded diaries and brittle books leaned precariously, their spines cracked, titles faded to illegibility. One caught my eye, a leather-bound tome with strange symbols etched into its cover. The texture of the leather was unnerving under my fingers, rough and almost organic. "Occult practices," I muttered under my breath, flipping carefully through the book's yellowed pages. The text was handwritten in cramped, looping script, interspersed with diagrams of circles, triangles, and symbols I didn't recognize. It wasn't just a record. It was a guide. The amulet around my neck grew warm, its faint glow lighting the edge of my vision. I reached up to touch it, the smooth metal grounding me against the growing sense of unease. Whatever had happened in this room, it had left its mark, and my sixth sense was picking up on it. At the room's center was a large wooden table, its surface cluttered with what I could only describe as ritual artifacts. The wood was scarred with knife marks, blackened in places by what looked like burns. A brass bowl sat in the middle, its interior stained dark with something I didn't want to identify. Surrounding it were an assortment of items. A ceremonial dagger with an intricately carved handle, several unlit candles, and small figurines carved from bone. I leaned closer, my flashlight catching a glint of metal. One of the figurines had a face, crudely etched, but disturbingly lifelike. Its expression was frozen in a scream. "Charming?" I muttered, pulling out my notebook and sketching the table's layout. I didn't dare disturb anything, but the need to document it was overwhelming. As I jotted down details, My eyes caught sight of a journal sitting just beyond the brass bowl. Its cover was simpler than the others, a plain brown leather, unassuming in its design. I picked it up carefully, the weight of it solid in my hands, and flipped to the first page. Property of Edward Ashwick. It read in neat, precise handwriting. Ashwick Manor's original owner. The man in the painting upstairs, with his stern eyes and rigid posture. I settled onto a low wooden stool near the table and began to read, my flashlight casting a shaky beam over the pages. The journal started innocuously enough. Notes about the manor's construction, the difficulties of sourcing labor, and the triumph of completing his family's grand estate. But as I turned the pages, the tone darkened. Edward Ashwick had become obsessed with the idea of protection. The journal described his growing paranoia, whispers in the night, shadows where there shouldn't be shadows. He believed the house, despite its grandeur, was vulnerable to outside forces. His solution: summon something to guard it. My stomach twisted as I read further. The rituals he described were complex and unsettling, filled with references to ancient texts and incantations he claimed to have translated himself. The diagrams matched those in the book I'd seen earlier, symbols, circles, and markings meant to focus energy. I sought only to protect what is mine, one passage read. But I fear I have called something beyond my understanding. It is powerful, yes, but it does not obey. It watches, and it waits. The entries became more frantic. Edward wrote of strange occurrences. Objects moving on their own, servants falling ill, the youngest Ashwick child waking up screaming, claiming to see eyes in the dark. He began to suspect that the spirit he summoned wasn't a guardian at all. It twists our home, he wrote, twists us. My wife no longer smiles. The children grow quiet, their laughter gone. And I feel its presence always, like a shadow that does not follow the light. My pulse quickened as I read the final entries. Edward had attempted to banish the spirit, using another ritual scrawled in shaky handwriting. He didn't say if it worked, but he ended with a chilling admission. I cannot undo what I have done. The house belongs to it now, and so do we. I closed the journal, the weight of Edward's words pressing down on me like the damp air in the room. The amulet's glow had intensified, its warmth now bordering on hot. It was as if it sensed the same thing I did. Something was still here, watching, waiting. A soft noise broke the silence, pulling me from my thoughts. It wasn't the whispering or laughter from before. This was closer. Breathing. I stood slowly, my flashlight scanning the room, but the shadows seemed thicker now, almost alive. My grip on the journal tightened. Whatever Edward Ashwick had summoned, it hadn't left, and I was standing in its lair. The journal weighed heavy in my hands, not just with its leather-bound heft but with the implications of its contents. Ashwick's words were a confession, a chronicle of a man consumed by paranoia and hubris. As I flipped back through the pages, piecing together fragments of his ritualistic obsession, I felt the house around me growing colder. The damp chill seeped through my coat and into my skin, as if the basement itself resented my presence. He'd called it a guardian spirit, a thing meant to protect his family and home. But in his desperation, Ashwick had underestimated what he was summoning, or overestimated his control. The journal painted a picture of something ancient, powerful, and deeply malevolent. It had taken the family instead of shielding them, turning them into prisoners within their own home. And now it wasn't just the Ashwicks who were trapped here. The crossed-out names from the portrait upstairs swam into my mind. Those names hadn't been part of the family. They were outsiders, servants, visitors, and wanderers who'd stumbled into the manor over the years, just like me. Claimed by the house. I took a sharp breath, flipping to one of the last entries in the journal. Ashwick had written of shadows that moved on their own, voices calling to him from empty rooms, and a chilling revelation that struck me like a blow. It feeds on us, our fears, our regrets. We are its fuel, and in return, it holds us here, somewhere between life and death. It is not content with us alone. It hungers still, seeking more to claim. The penmanship in that final entry was almost illegible, shaky and uneven as if his hand had trembled with every word. The air around me grew colder still. My breath clouded in front of me, and the faint glow of my amulet intensified, spreading warmth over my chest as though it were trying to shield me. I froze when I saw it. The shadows at the edge of the room had begun to shift, gathering like smoke coiling into a single shape. My flashlight flickered, its beam dancing erratically before sputtering out completely, plunging the basement into a suffocating darkness. "Damn it!" I hissed, smacking the flashlight, but the light didn't return. The shadows continued to gather, taking on a vaguely humanoid form. Its edges rippled like smoke caught in a breeze, but its center was darker than the surrounding night, a void that seemed to drink in what little light remained. Then it spoke. "Join them," it whispered, its voice jagged and raw, like shattered glass scraping against itself. The sound was both quiet and deafening, reverberating in my skull. I stumbled back, my fingers tightening instinctively around the journal. "I don't think so," I muttered, though the tremor in my voice betrayed my bravado. The figure didn't move, but I felt it pressing closer, an oppressive weight that made the air harder to breathe. My sixth sense screamed warnings, a sharp, visceral alarm that drowned out all rational thought. "You don't belong here," I said, louder this time, hoping the sound of my own voice would anchor me. "And I don't either." The figure tilted its head, its form flickering like a flame caught in a gust. When it spoke again, the words came slower, deliberate, each syllable laced with malice. They did not belong either, and yet they stayed. The temperature plummeted further, the damp air crystallizing into frost along the shelves and floor. My breath came in quick, shallow gasps, and I could feel the chill biting into me, numbing my fingers even through my gloves. Images flashed in my mind, faces I didn't recognize but instinctively knew were the people from the portrait. Their expressions were twisted with fear and despair, their mouths open in silent screams. Behind them, the shadow loomed, devouring everything. I clutched the amulet, its glow pulsing steadily against my palm. Its warmth was the only thing keeping me from succumbing to the encroaching cold, a faint light in the midst of overwhelming darkness. "This house isn't yours," I said, stepping back toward the stairs, though every instinct screamed at me not to turn my back. "You were summoned here, and you can be sent away," the figure hissed, the sound slicing through the air like a knife. Foolish. They thought the same. It surged forward, faster than I'd anticipated. I stumbled, barely avoiding its grasp as it extended a tendril-like arm, the edges of its form breaking apart and reforming with each movement. My back hit the wall, and I fumbled for the notebook in my pocket. The crossed-out names flashed in my mind again. They weren't just victims. They were warnings. Every name was a reminder of what this entity had done and what it was capable of. My hand brushed the etchings carved into the walls, symbols I had copied in my notebook. Protective wards, hastily scrawled by someone who had tried and failed to keep the entity at bay. "You don't get to claim me," I said, my voice firmer now as I felt the symbols under my fingers. "Not tonight." The figure hesitated, its shape flickering uncertainly. My amulet's glow intensified, flooding the room with a faint but steady light. The warmth spread outward, pushing back the cold and forcing the shadow to retreat, its edges dissolving into the darkness. The whispers faded, and the oppressive weight lifted, leaving me gasping for air. The basement was silent again, but the chill lingered, a reminder of what had just transpired. I straightened, clutching the journal tightly. If Edward Ashwick's words were true, this thing was bound to the house, but it was growing stronger, feeding on those it claimed. If I didn't stop it, I would be next. I didn't climb back up the stairs. Not yet. The journal sat heavy in my hands, the weight of its revelations pressing against my chest. Edward Ashwick's notes were uncomfortably clear. The spirit wasn't just bound to the house, it was intertwined with it, feeding on the souls it trapped. And if the crossed-out names were any indication, it had a voracious appetite. But there was a way to end it. A ritual. Ashwick had recorded it hastily, scrawled across the last few pages of the journal with ink that smudged and ran. as though his trembling hands had barely been able to hold the pen. He'd tried and failed, the entity devouring his family before turning its attention to him. Now it was my turn. I laid the journal on the ritual table, sweeping aside dust and cobwebs to make room. The symbols on the walls began to shift in my mind, patterns forming where chaos had been. They were incomplete, a circle broken, lines left unfinished. I could see the gaps now, and I could fix them. The amulet glowed hot against my chest, its heat almost painful. "All right," I muttered, my voice low but steady. No turning back. The room seemed to tighten around me, the damp air pressing against my skin like an unwelcome hand. My pen scratched against the notebook as I copied Ashwick's instructions and filled in the missing pieces. The ritual required precision, a series of invocations to sever the entity's bond to the house, followed by a binding incantation to banish it for good. But it came with a warning, scrawled in a desperate hand beneath the final incantation. "One mistake, and you are lost." I began by clearing the table. The brass bowl, the candles, the bone figurines. I placed each item exactly where the instructions dictated, recreating Ashwick's ritual step by step. My hands shook, but I couldn't afford hesitation. The first chant left my throat raw, the ancient words unfamiliar and sharp, like glass against my tongue. As the sound echoed through the basement, the house began to stir. The temperature plummeted. The doors slammed upstairs, one after another, the sound reverberating through the walls like gunshots. The floor beneath my feet groaned, the wood buckling as if it were alive. "Not today," I growled, gripping the amulet as I forced the next words out. The shadows thickened, pooling at the edges of the room. From them, faces emerged, twisted, anguished, their hollow eyes locked on me. The whispers returned, urgent and desperate, voices crying out in dozens of overlapping tones. "Stop! Don't! It will take you to." I faltered, the weight of their pleas cutting into me like barbed wire. My pen froze over the notebook, my breath catching in my throat. The temptation to stop, to run, was overwhelming. But I wasn't running. Not this time. I slammed my hand against the table, my voice rising over the cacophony. "You don't scare me." It was a lie, of course. I was terrified, but fear wasn't going to stop me now. The next incantation spilled from my lips in a defiant shout, the words tearing through the air. The room shook violently, jars crashing from the shelves and shattering against the floor. The shadows recoiled, writhing as though the sound burned them. Then, from the center of the room it emerged. The spirit. No longer an indistinct shadow, it stood before me, a monstrous amalgamation of anguish and rage. Its form was jagged and shifting, its body made of writhing tendrils and twisted faces. Eyes, too many of them, blinked in unison, and its mouth stretched unnaturally wide, filled with teeth that didn't belong to anything human. "You dare!" it hissed, its voice layered with 1,000 screams. "You cannot undo what has been done. This house is mine. They are mine." The amulet burned against my chest, a fiery reminder of what was at stake. "They were never yours," I said, gripping the brass bowl. "And neither is this house." I poured salt into the bowl, following the journal's instructions, then struck a match and lit the candles. The flames flickered wildly as I raised the bowl above my head, chanting the final incantation. The spirit howled, its voice shaking the very foundations of the manor. Its tendrils lashed out, striking the walls and floor, sending splinters flying. One grazed my arm, leaving a burning gash, but I didn't stop. As I completed the chant, the symbols on the walls blazed to life, their golden light searing through the darkness. The entity writhed, its form splitting and reforming as it fought to resist the ritual's power. "You cannot banish me," it screamed, its voice a thunderclap that rattled my skull. "I am eternal." The light from the symbols surged, a tidal wave of brilliance that swept through the room. The spirit's form began to disintegrate, its tendrils crumbling into ash. Its howls grew fainter, the voices of its victims rising above it in a collective wail of release. I shouted the final words, pouring every ounce of strength into the incantation. The amulet flared one last time, its heat searing into my skin, and the entity collapsed into itself with a deafening roar. Then there was silence. I stood there, gasping for air, my hands shaking as the glow from the symbols faded. The room was still, the oppressive weight of the spirit finally gone. The amulet cooled against my chest, its warmth a quiet comfort. I looked down at the journal, now spattered with ash and blood. Edward Ashwick's curse was undone, but his legacy would never be forgotten. For a moment, I thought I heard the faintest whisper of gratitude. Then it was gone. The silence was unbearable. After the roar of the entity's collapse, the deafening cacophony of its screams and the burst of light that seemed to crack the very air, the quiet was too much. My ears rang as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for a verdict. I leaned against the ritual table, my legs trembling beneath me. The journal lay open, the pages now smudged with ash and blood. I stared at the symbols scrawled across the room, their golden glow fading into dull, lifeless carvings. The oppressive cold that had gripped the basement for hours was gone, replaced by a hollow stillness. It was over. The amulet around my neck cooled, its faint glow dimming to nothing. I touched it instinctively, the warmth it had given me now a memory. For the first time since stepping into Ashwick Manor, I could breathe deeply. The air, while still damp and stale, no longer felt like it was being pulled from my lungs by an unseen force. But the silence wasn't entirely empty. Faint whispers drifted around me, soft as a breeze through autumn leaves. The voices weren't desperate or angry anymore. They were relieved, grateful. I couldn't make out words, but the tone was unmistakable. The souls that had been trapped here, bound by the malevolent force, were finally free. As the whispers faded, I felt a pang of something I hadn't expected: sadness. These people, Edward Ashwick, his family, the others who had been claimed over the decades, they were gone now, released into whatever lay beyond this world. They had suffered so much, and though I had freed them, I couldn't shake the weight of their pain. The front door creaked open above me, the sound echoing down the staircase like a distant invitation. I hadn't touched it. That gave me pause. I grabbed the journal, tucking it into my coat pocket. My flashlight was dead, but I didn't need it anymore. Faint daylight spilled into the basement, the weak morning sun filtering through the narrow stairwell. My feet felt like lead as I climbed, each step a reminder of how close I'd come to being another name crossed off the list. The house greeted me with an eerie stillness. The hallways that had once creaked and groaned were silent. The rocking chair in the parlor stood motionless, and the oppressive weight that had hung over everything was gone. But something was different. Ashwick Manor had changed, its atmosphere less malevolent but no less unsettling. Without the entity, it was just a hollow shell, a place abandoned by time and stained by tragedy. I could feel the echoes of what had happened here, like the faint smell of smoke after a fire. I stepped into the foyer, my boots crunching against broken glass and splinters. The front door stood ajar, its rusted hinges groaning faintly as the breeze pushed it back and forth. Daylight spilled through the gap, and for the first time in hours, I felt the warmth of the sun on my face. I crossed the threshold slowly, as if expecting the house to pull me back. But it didn't. The overgrown grass and weeds that choked the manor's grounds seemed almost inviting now, their wildness a stark contrast to the suffocating darkness I'd faced inside. I stumbled down the crumbling steps, the journal pressing against my ribs, and stood in the weak sunlight, letting it wash over me. My knees buckled, and I sank to the ground, exhaustion finally catching up to me. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I pressed my forehead against the cool earth, trying to ground myself. I was alive, barely but alive. For a moment, I closed my eyes and listened. No whispers.
No footsteps.
Just the wind rustling through the trees and the distant call of a bird. But then came the doubt. Something wasn't right. The amulet hung cold and inert against my chest, but the weight of it felt different now, heavier, almost. I reached up to touch it, but my fingers recoiled as a faint sense of unease crept into my mind. Had I truly ended it? The thought struck me like a hammer. The ritual had worked, I was sure of that. The entity was gone, and the souls had been released. But as I sat there on the grass, staring back at the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't walked out alone. I pulled out my notebook, flipping past frantic sketches of symbols and scrawled observations until I reached a blank page. My pen hovered over it, trembling slightly. I needed to record this, to leave some kind of mark for myself, or for whoever might find this book should I disappear like the others. I wrote one line: Ashwick is quiet, but the shadows remain. The words sat heavy on the page, final yet uncertain. I closed the notebook, tucking it into my coat as I stood. Behind me, the manor loomed, its cracked windows catching the morning light like empty eyes. I turned away, forcing my legs to move, but the feeling didn't leave me. Something had followed me out. What it was, I didn't know. Not yet. But the chill creeping up my spine told me one thing for certain. Ashwick's story wasn't over. And neither was mine.